No, living in America isn't better than Europe. All right, you guys sent this one over to me and I had to check it out. I'm really curious to see what's going on. I have no idea which one is better to live in, because I feel for you to be able to make a choice on what is better to live in, America or Europe. I'm sure most of you would say it's Europe, and personally, if I had to lean one way, it'd probably be America, because that's the only place I've ever lived. But if you live in both places, I think you definitely have a better perspective on what is better. A better perspective on what is better. That's such an intelligent sentence there, Jacob. All right, this one is coming from the Invisible Hand. Let's just get straight into it.
Take a look at this map here. It shows just how rich every US state is, ranked by GDP per capita. And down here on this bottom right section is America's poorest state, Mississippi.
Okay, I know exactly where this is going. I have been seeing this nonstop on X, formerly Twitter. People just arguing, and I saw these posts of Americans just being annoying, posting like Mississippi has a higher GDP per capita than the UK, and then everyone in the UK is like talking shit back, and I'm like, that I immediately thought, I was like, none of this makes any sense, because I know that living somewhere like in the UK or Germany or Norway or any one of these nice cities in one of your guys' countries, I was like, it's not better than living in like a bad part of Mississippi. Because Mississippi is not a great state. I mean, it's fine, but there actually borders my state, but it's just such dumb arguments. Let's see where this is going.
Which, according to this metric, is still richer than pretty much all of Europe. That's right, things are now so bad in Europe and the UK that they are poorer than America's poorest state. But what if this was all a load of rubbish? This is the table that puts the UK below Mississippi on GDP per capita. But what if we didn't rank the UK by GDP? But instead by things that actually measure how good your life is. Suddenly, the UK isn't last anymore, but first. On life expectancy, years in education, homicide rates, healthcare coverage. Across pretty much every conceivable measure, the UK seems to be doing better than the US.
I will say that GDP, it's somewhat important. It's not like you shouldn't ignore it completely, but yeah, some of these other factors are also just as important, if not more important. Now, I have my quarrels with some of the statistics, and it's hard for me to even really like full on believe any statistic that I see for literally anything, because I never know what the motive is behind it, who did the stat, where it's coming from. So, I take everything, it's kind of like surface level. It's just information to kind of digest and come to my own conclusion. But yeah, that GDP it's important, but it's not everything. Trust me.
If that's the case, then why do we even use GDP at all? And more importantly, is America actually richer than Europe? Or have we just been measuring it wrong? If you were to take a look at a map of Europe, then pretty much every country, bar these ones here, fit into the bucket of being poorer than Mississippi. Yet many of these supposedly poor countries have free healthcare, higher life expectancy.
I really wish we gotta stop saying free healthcare. Just say universal healthcare. It's cool. Like, I like it. Just say it.
Look like this rather than this. For whatever reason, this figure, GDP per capita, has become the single number by which countries are judged, by politicians, the media, and now increasingly by ordinary people trying to work out whether their country is doing well or falling behind. On one level, it's not exactly hard to see why this has happened. For basically as long as human civilization has existed, people have looked for ways to compare themselves. There is a famous saying that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And this was exactly the thinking back in 1934 America, right in the depths of the Great Depression. Policymakers were trying desperately to kickstart the US economy out of a hole, but they kept encountering the same exact problem. They had no reliable way to measure the size and health of the economy, and so no way to see if what they were doing was actually having any impact. So in walked this guy here, Simon Kuznets, who presented the first comprehensive set of national income accounts to the US Congress in 1934. What he'd built was essentially what we now call gross domestic product, the total value of everything a country produces in a year, and when you divide that by the number of people in the country, you get GDP per capita, a rough measure of how much economic output there is per
I already
person.
know where this is
For
going.
the first time in history, policymakers could now look at a single number and get a read on whether the economy was moving in the right direction. Now, Kuznets himself did actually warn that you can't judge the entirety of a country just on a single number like this. But policymakers effectively took his number and ran with it. And within a decade, it had become the international standard tool for measuring countries. Now, it's inevitably a bit reductive to try and compare wildly different countries with a single number. But there are at least a couple reasons why the world has become so obsessed with GDP, beyond the fact that it's easy to remember and makes for a good headline. Firstly, because at a top line level, it kind of works. If you were to plot every country in the world by GDP per person against how many years the average person spends in school, then they move almost perfectly together. Part of this is that countries who prioritise the education of their population will of course end up richer. But there's also the fact that richer countries are just able to spend more on their population's education. And if we take a look at other measures, like life expectancy, even happiness levels, we see exactly the same thing. The richer you are, the better you do. So even if GDP itself doesn't matter that much, it's closely linked with the things that do, which is really why it's become so widely adopted in the first place. But the thing is, the second it shifts from a broad indicator of whether your country is heading in the right direction to something you use to make precise comparisons between individual nations, a ton of problems start to emerge. In 2023, the IMF declared Ireland the richest country in the world.
We have done a video on this in Ireland before. It's kind of what he was just showing there, where it was like, okay, so you take the total amount of what everyone earns, the property, and then you divide it by the number of people there. Well, if it's like, if you have 100,000 people and only 1,000 of them are the ones that have all of the wealth, and you're basing the GDP off of that, then it's not really accurate of what everyone is experiencing there. Some of the other factors that they use, like happiness and school and things like that, definitely valuable. But Ireland, we did a video on Ireland, and I had no idea that Ireland had this corporation, I don't want to say Ponzi scheme, but like monopoly going on over there, to where if you open a corporation in Ireland, don't quote me on this, I believe you don't really have to pay any taxes or like very minimal taxes. And then that is attributing to the GDP of Ireland, which in reality is fake. So it's just nuts. It's so wild that this is what people use to measure things. And then also that just average blokes on the internet are just arguing back and forth between people's countries. It's just so dumb.
As its GDP per capita edged over $145,000. This made it not just richer than its neighbour, the UK, but placed it ahead of countries like Singapore, Luxembourg, and even Switzerland. However, if you've actually been to Switzerland or Ireland, then you know things are a little different. Average incomes in Ireland are €41,000, and it's facing one of the worst housing crises in Europe. Back in 2015, Ireland's GDP grew by 24% in a single year, technically the highest growth ever recorded in post-war Europe. But not because people's lives were getting any better, simply because Apple had restructured its books. By 2017, half of the top 50 Irish firms were American businesses, and Apple made up 20% of Ireland's entire economy. So, on paper, Ireland's GDP economy was booming, but in reality, nearly a quarter of this growth that year had been derived from iPhone sales. If GDP can be this easily detached from reality in one country, it raises a pretty obvious question. How much of the gap between the US and Europe is measuring real differences in people's lives? Before we look into that, I want to thank today's sponsor, Odoo. I started making videos on YouTube in 2023.
Yo, shout out to this guy that's making this video. He's doing a fantastic job.
This has come with a lot of different tools in a lot of different places. And that's where Odoo comes in, an all-in-one business management platform designed to make the day-to-day running of your business easier. Odoo offers more than 45 interconnected apps, from sales, project management, inventory to web creation. One of my favourite Odoo apps is eSign. If you're sending contracts, agreements, or any kind of document that needs a signature, you can do the whole thing inside Odoo. You upload your document, add one or more signers, then drag and drop the fields you need, like name, date, email, signature, anywhere in the document. Set the order you want people to sign in, schedule automatic reminders, and send it off. Odoo then handles the chasing for you, so nothing gets held up on waiting anymore. Signers can view documents on any device and sign them with a few clicks. You can track exactly where each document is in real time, whether it's pending, signed, or declined, and you get notified as soon as the status changes. All actions
Kinda
are
like
securely
DocuSign?
recorded, and it's also legally compliant with electronic signature standards in over 100 countries, so you're covered wherever you're doing business. What's great about Odoo is that your first app is free, for life, with unlimited hosting and support. Try Odoo's first app, like eSign, for free today using the link in the description. Now let's get back to the video. There is a classic trope online about the European worker taking 3-hour lunch breaks, logging off at 4 PM, and of course, taking 5 weeks of holiday in August.
Yep, I've heard all of these. If anything, we just get more jealous hearing about it rather than like mad or
much to the anger of their diligent American counterparts. And while that's maybe a slight exaggeration, this effect does tend to show up in the data. On average, Europeans work 3 hours less per week than Americans. And that's mostly because 50% of Americans work over 40 hours per week, compared to only 31% of Europe.
I'm guilty. I work a lot.
Of course, if the average person is working less, they'll also end up being paid less. So the region's GDP will of course end up being lower. And this working hours gap is estimated to make up around 28% of the difference in GDP. But that obviously doesn't mean Europeans' lives are any worse. They've just chosen to take more time off over more money. But even after we strip that out, the holidays, the long lunches, and just look at what each person produces in the hours they're actually at their desk, Americans are still 18% more productive. That might not sound like a lot, but across an economy the size of the EU or the US, it's equal to about $6 trillion. Enough to fund the entire US military 6 times over. Alright, so there is still clearly a major gap between the United States and Europe. But there is still a massive problem with this comparison between the two areas.
Yeah, I like where he's kind of going. It's like, yeah, obviously America is richer than like pretty much every country on earth. I mean, it's pretty commonly known. You dip into Switzerland and Luxembourg and some of these countries, yeah, massively wealthy, right? But that's just the comparison. I just can't stand it this is where the comparison has gone for GDP per capita.
Early 2024, Tucker Carlson went on a widely televised event to Russia, where he, amongst other things, marveled at the seemingly miraculously cheap groceries that were on display. Now, his assumption was simple. If a basket of groceries costs less in Russia, then life there must be more affordable than in America. But those groceries weren't cheap because Russia is a rich country. They were cheap because the ruble is weak. So a dollar converted into rubles just buys you more stuff than it would back home. And when we apply this to our Europe versus America debate, some interesting things begin to pop up. Back in 1986, a journalist at The Economist called Pam Woodall was battling with the very same problem, trying to compare what life actually costs in different countries, but getting misled by variations in exchange rates. What she needed was a universally consumed product, which would allow her to compare country to country. And her answer for this was the Big Mac. Her logic was simple. Nearly every country in the world has a McDonald's, and thanks to their product standardization, whether you buy a Big Mac in New York or Taipei, it's essentially the same homogeneous burger. So if a Big Mac costs $5.50 in New York, but $2.30 in Taiwan, give or take, you can say that your money goes roughly 58% further in Taiwan. And mapped across every single country, you get this table here, the Big Mac Index. Scaled up to the entire economy, 43%. You can start to see the problem. When we compare how wealthy countries are by using GDP, we're not measuring how much stuff people can actually afford in their daily lives. We're measuring how their income looks when we convert it into dollars, which is a completely different thing. And that gets even more misleading when currencies move about. Over the last couple of decades, the dollar has been getting stronger and stronger, quietly making the US look a lot richer compared to everyone else than it actually is. Since 2011 alone, the dollar has gained 20% against the euro, meaning America's GDP compared to Europe got 20% bigger without anybody actually producing anything more. Now, there is actually a way of accounting for this effect, basically using the same principle behind the Big Mac Index to create what is known as purchasing power parity. Rather than converting currencies using whatever the exchange rate happens to be on a given day, it looks at how much it actually costs to buy the same things in different countries. And when you make that adjustment, the gap between the US and the EU cuts basically in half. Now, that isn't to say that there isn't a real gap. Europe does have a genuine productivity problem. Since 2008, growth has been sluggish, and the continent
Okay.
hasn't produced tech companies at anything close to the American scale. Its share of the global economy has been shrinking, and there are real structural issues that have held Europe back. But even so, the gap is still miles away from the Mississippi versus France picture that we started with. And even with these purchasing power parity adjustments, it doesn't really capture the full story. It's worth remembering what the original point of GDP actually is. It's not that the number itself matters, but that it tends to be correlated with the things that do. Life expectancy, education, physical and mental health. On the surface, it's not hard to see why. If people are richer, then they can afford better healthcare, better schools, and generally a better quality of life. But that's only true if the wealth is somewhat equally shared across the population. If you had a country of 10 people, where 9 of them were broke, but there was still 1 billionaire,
Yeah, he's using my analogy that I said earlier. Okay, cool.
then they
Glad he
will
went
on
there.
average be multi-millionaires. Which, surprise surprise, isn't too dissimilar from what's happening in the United States right now. Take this graph here. It shows the relationship between income inequality and GDP per capita. Typically, as countries get richer, they also become more equal. And it kind of checks. The most unequal countries are places in Africa, then the poorer parts of Asia, and finally rich Asian countries in Europe, which are the most equal. But there is one major exception to this trend. The US has a level of income inequality closer to Kenya and Cameroon than it does to France or Germany, despite the fact that by at least some metrics it's the richest country in Earth. And over the last couple of decades, this problem has only gotten worse.
Yeah, this is what we call the middle class evaporation that has been happening over the last like decade or 15 years here in the US. The middle class is pretty much going away. It's either, you're lower class or you're a higher class. It's just been eroding over time.
Of US earners took home about 10% of the total national income. Today, they take home double that. In Europe, on the other hand, the richest share rose from 10% to just 12%, while
Much
the
more
share
stable.
of the bottom 50% remained basically the same. So yes,
Okay.
the US has been getting richer, but the gains have been almost entirely captured by people who were already wealthy. For the average American, the extra trillions showing up in GDP are totally meaningless. And remember, the only reason GDP became so widely adopted wasn't that the number itself matters, but that it tends to be correlated with things that do. And that correlation only holds if the wealth is actually shared. And in the US, increasingly it isn't. Life expectancy, for example, has basically plateaued in America at around 79 years since 2010, whilst in the rest of Western Europe it has continued to increase. In
Food.
Mississippi, overall life expectancy is just 71 years, and for men it drops to 69.5.
I do want to shout out Mississippi really quick. They have done something pretty crazy in our country with education, though. They went from like dead last in education to up in the upper tier now. I don't know exactly what they did, but I did see that stat and I was pretty impressed to go from dead last to, I think they were ranked, like I said, I don't know, they were up in maybe the top 10 or so. They've done really well over the last like decade.
To put that into perspective, Bangladesh, one of the poorest countries in Asia, has a life expectancy of around 75 years, despite
Dang.
having a GDP per capita 20 times lower than that of the US. The US also ranks near the bottom of wealthy nations for infant mortality, and dying before your first birthday is more likely in America than almost every other rich country on Earth. Beyond just life expectancy, the average American graduates from college with hundreds of thousands of dollars in student debt, and in most of Europe, university is basically free.
It's one of the main reasons that I didn't go to university after high school. It was just too expensive. I just went straight to work. I was like, no, I'm just gonna do my own thing. I just went and just started working. I was like, I don't want $100,000 or $200,000 in debt.
It has no statutory minimum paid holiday entitlement, while European workers are legally guaranteed at least 4 weeks. And perhaps most importantly, despite spending more per capita on healthcare than any other country on Earth, roughly double what France and Germany spend, Americans report higher rates of chronic illness, worse access to mental health treatment, and lower satisfaction with their care.
It's the food. You can spend more on healthcare all you want. People are still gonna get sick when they're eating horrible food.
That all makes using GDP alone seem like a pretty misleading indicator at best, but that in itself isn't really anything new. People have been pointing out GDP's flaws almost since the day it was created, and over the decades there have been dozens of attempts to replace it, or at least supplement it with something better. The UN created the Human Development Index in 1990, which folds in life expectancy and education alongside income. Then there's the Genuine Progress Indicator, which tries to subtract things like pollution and inequality from the total, rather than just adding everything up. And the OECD has its Better Life Index. Bhutan famously built something called the Gross National Happiness into its constitution. And yet, all of these alternatives have never really been adopted. Maybe just because everybody is just used to using it.
Man, that's it. All right. Fantastic video. I enjoyed that so much. That was so well done. Shout out to the Invisible Hand, you guys. I'll have a link to this video down in the description below. Go check it out. Show them some love. Share it with people. And with that, I'm just going to get out of here. Appreciate you guys watching. Hopefully I didn't ramble too much, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.